welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this Microfiche time capsule, we are looking back at the Juvenile Instructor from the 1st of December 1900, and this article is entitled Lives of Our Leaders, the Apostle Rudger Clawson. So, I do happen to know a little bit about Rudger Clawson, as I have mentioned. He is one of the people I have written about. And there are a couple of very distinct stories about him as a young man, and then later. So I know that this will at least cover the two from his youth that are very well known and prominent. He was kind of famous for both of these incidents. So I don't think that it was something that was known even at the time that he lived. So I'm not concerned about people like not knowing about them. So I'm sure that they are covered here. I am sure of it. So let's take a look, and I think this will be really fun. Also, I will throw in my own conclusion at the end. All right, Rudger Clawson. Apostle Rudger Clawson is yet young in the high calling of apostleship, as he is not old in years, but he is a striking example of that diversity of experiences which is characteristic of the lives of the Latter-day Saints. In this great Latter-day struggle of the principles of truth and right against the powers of the evil one, not many who have enlisted in the cause of God may lead a quiet, uneventful career. No, to such life is full of stir, of struggles, of trials, of experiences many and varied, all of which give to life its greatest educational value. At the present writing, a small part only of the life of Apostle Clawson can be given, yet within that brief period have occurred events that have brought him into prominence before the Latter-day Saints. See, he was well known at the time. Apostle Rudger Clawson was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, March 12, 1857, being the son of Bishop H.B. Clawson and Margaret Gay Judd Clawson. He was educated in the schools of his native city. The teachers who seem to have influenced him most were Dr. Carl G. Mazer, Miss Cook, and Dr. John R. Park. Yeah, Carl G. Mazer is probably the most famous one. From his earliest boyhood, Elder Clawson was religiously inclined. One of the shaping forces of his character was his early reading of the Book of Mormon. His own words on this subject teach a lesson full of interest and deep meaning to the young Latter-day Saints. Early in life I became deeply interested in the Book of Mormon, he says, which I read and reread, and drew from its divine pages inspiration and hope. Faith sprang up in my heart. By a careful study of that glorious book, well-defined ideas of right and wrong were firmly fixed in my youthful mind, and I was thus measurably able to withstand the temptations that assailed me, and was able to escape many of the sins and follies to which some of the young are addicted. With advanced years, the conviction has constantly grown upon me that the Book of Mormon is one of the grandest books of the age. Regarding the meeting going of the small boy, Elder Clawson bears this testimony. I remember the interest I felt as a boy in the Sunday meetings at the old tabernacle, and later in the large new tabernacle. The sermons of Presidents Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, George A. Smith, and the apostles and elders made a profound impression on my mind for good. From my own experience, I am led to believe that the effects and influence of the teachings of our leaders upon the youth of Zion, I mean the very small boys and girls who in the midst of the congregation sit almost unnoticed, is greater than many suppose. That's kind of cool. This is not the story I was talking about, though. You'll know it when you hear it. An important adjunct to Elder Clawson's school life was the Wasatch Literary Society, whose membership was composed of his companions and associates, boys and girls of early days, many of whom have since become prominent in public life. Shortly after leaving school, the young man, then only 18 years old, became private secretary to Honorable John W. Young, then president of the Utah Western Railway Company. In this capacity, he spent 2 years in the East, visiting most of the prominent places, but spending the greater part of his time in New York City. This trip gave the young man much practical and valuable experience. In 1879, Elder Clawson was called on a mission to the southern states. And here we go. All right? And it was while laboring in the state of Georgia, preaching the gospel of Christ, that his friend and companion missionary, Elder Joseph Standing, was shot down by a brutal mob. The news at the time sent a thrill of horror through the church. briefly told the terrible experience and Elder Clawson's part in it is as follows. In the summer of 1879, Elder Clawson and Elder Standing, who were laboring in Georgia, started for a conference of the elders to be held in the city of Rome, that state. On the way, they were to call on some members of the church living at Varnell's Station, Whitfield County. Elder Standing had previously labored in that section and had succeeded in raising up a branch of the church. The missionaries reached the place in the evening of Saturday, July 9th. Calling at the house of a church member, they found the family to be in a state of great excitement, owing to the threats made against the elders in that neighborhood. Because of this bitter and murderous feeling, the brethren were refused the privilege of stopping overnight at the house. They were, however, directed to the house of a Mr. Henry Holston, who was not a member of the church but was friendly to the elders. Mr. Holston received the missionaries kindly, and when the situation was explained to him, he said he would defend them as long as they were under his roof. Elder Standing appeared pale and anxious over the trouble which threatened them. A dream he had had a short time previous seemed to worry him, as it appeared to forebode evil. The next day was Sunday. The morning opened beautiful, and the two elders set out to get their satchels and bring them back to Mr. Holston's place. They found the family still fearful of trouble, so did not remain long. The road between the two houses was densely wooded on both sides. On the way back to Holston's, the two young missionaries suddenly came upon 12 men, some on horseback and some on foot. They were all armed, and as they caught sight of the elders, they set up great yells of exultation and came rushing toward them like a pack of hungry wolves. Elder Standing asked the men by what authority they were thus molested on the public highway. "We'll show you by what authority we act," they replied. One of them jumped from his horse and came up to Elder Clawson with a cocked revolver, pointing it to his face, and at the same time uttering vile and most blasphemous language. The mob then ordered the brethren to follow them, which they did. To the expostulation of the elders that they were peaceful, law-abiding citizens, the mob replied, "The government of the United States is against you, and there is no law in Georgia for Mormons." In this march to violence, Elder Clawson walked rather slowly, and thus lagged somewhat. At this, one of the ruffians came up behind him and struck a terrible blow on the back of the head, causing him to fall forward. He was, however, up again in an instant, but he knew he could do nothing to resent the attack. Shortly after, the wretch attacked him again with a club, which only his comrades prevented him from using over Elder Clawson's head. After a time, they left the road and went deeper into the woods. The party met an old man, well known in the neighborhood, and a girl by the name of Mary Hamblin, who had come to warn the elders. Elder Clawson feared that the mob would injure the girl, but they let her go at the threat. Soon they came to a beautiful spot in the woods, a spring of clear water shaded by a large tree. Here a halt was made, and the party seated themselves around the pool of water. Here the mobbers conversed for about an hour and a half, accusing the Mormons of all manner of vile acts. They seemed very eager to learn something of the whereabouts of Elder John Morgan, against whom they seemed to have a deep-seated hatred. They were much disappointed when they learned that he was in Utah. Presently, 3 horsemen who had left the party a short time previously rode up again. One of them gave a command to follow us. At the same time, Elder Standing, who was sitting with his back to the rider, suddenly leaped to his feet, turned, clapped his hands together, and shouted the words, "Surrender!" A man seated close to him pointed his pistol at him and fired, and the young missionary instantly fell. The mobbers at once rose, and one of them, pointing to Elder Clawson, said to his companion, "Shoot that man!" Instantly every weapon was turned upon him, and it seemed to the young man that he was standing on the brink of eternity. He faced the mob, folded his arms, and said, "Shoot!" But the order not to shoot was given, and the guns were lowered. Elder Clawson then went to his murdered companion and looked into his face, a ghastly wound in his forehead where the bullet had entered. Elder Clawson got permission from the mob to go after some assistance for his friend. Running through the woods, he hailed a woodchopper and asked him to assist in removing the body. "No, I haven't time," was the reply. Arriving at Mr. Holston's, that gentleman gave Brother Clawson a horse to go after the coroner, while he left for the scene of the assassination. Elder Clawson again met the mob on the road fleeing from the state. He feared that they would murder him also, but they let him pass unharmed, and with a thankful heart he traveled on. Arriving at Catoosa Springs, a fashionable watering place, telegrams were sent to Salt Lake City, and also to the governor of the state. The coroner, his clerk, and Brother Clawson then set out to get the body. They were joined by Mr. Holston on the way. The coroner held an inquest, and the body was laid upon a plank and carried to the house of Mr. Holston. Here, during that gloomy night, by the light of a candle, with the awestruck spectator standing near, Elder Clawson performed the last act of kindness to his friend in washing the awful stains from his body and preparing it for its final rest. After much difficulty and anger, Elder Clawson got the body safely on the train and arrived with it in Salt Lake City August 3rd. In September of the next year, Elder Clawson went back to Georgia to attend the trial of the murderers. Feeling was high against him in the state, but he had a duty to perform and he did it, although at the risk of his life. 3 of the murderers had been captured, and they had been indicted for murder in the first degree. The trial continued for 3 days. The jury's verdict was not guilty. The result was greeted with great demonstration by the spectators. A friend told Elder Clawson that he was in danger, and as soon as possible after the trial, he got quietly away. From the free, wandering life of a missionary to the pent-up quarters of a prison cell, such was the next change in the experience of Brother Clawson. Okay, so I'm going to pause here then for a moment. Yeah, that's not even quite the end of the story, although this is more detailed than the one I had in my head. But the gist was correct. Yeah, basically his mission companion was murdered in front of his eyes. And in fact, I remember reading his own account of this at a general conference later on. He said that when they all pointed the guns at him, and he folds his arms and says, "Shoot," he actually thought that they had shot him. For a brief moment, his eyes went dark. He couldn't see. He couldn't hear. He couldn't really breathe properly. Like, he was absolutely thought that he had just been killed. And it took him a second to realize that no one had shot. And he was like, "Oh, I'm still here." He honestly thought he was going to die at that moment. So them describing that as feeling on the brink of eternity is an understatement. So, I mean, I can't even imagine. He then washes the body. He accompanies it back to Salt Lake to return it to his family for burial. He stands up at the funeral and tells the story of what happened. Then he went back to Georgia to be a witness at the trial against the murderers, who were then acquitted. And then he was afraid for his life, so he had to leave the state. And here's the part that they did not mention, which I absolutely think should always be mentioned in the story, is he went then to a neighboring state and completed his mission. I honestly, personally, don't think that I could continue serving as a missionary after something that traumatic and horrific. But he did. I mean, he's amazing. He's remarkable. And anybody who could do that is a remarkable person. So I just wanted to share that end part with you because I know this story very well. He was very well known for this in general because he stood up and explained to like the entire church what happened to Elder Standing. And because as his mission companion, he was then well known in his own time, in his early 20s, yeah, as the mission companion of Elder Standing, who was shot in cold blood. So yeah. Okay, so catching up to the present of the story anyway, he went home from his mission after he completed it. He went home. He got married. He got married again. He had 2 wives, okay? So, now we're caught up. Okay. From the free wandering life of a missionary to the pent-up quarters of a prison cell, such was the next change in the experience of Elder Clawson. Having obeyed the law of plural marriage, Elder Clawson was one of the first victims of that terrible persecution which began under the Edmunds Law, and which made many thousand sufferers for conscience' sake. After a trial which attracted wide attention, Elder Clawson was convicted. He was sentenced to be imprisoned in the Utah Penitentiary for a term of 4 years and to pay a fine of $800. He entered the prison November 3rd, 1884. I want to mention here, this was not typical, okay? Most people who were convicted of unlawful cohabitation, which is the crime that the polygamists were brought to their attention, was brought to bear against them, I guess I should say. was $50 fine and 6 months in prison. His was 4 years in prison with a fine of $800. Like, you know, when you feel like that and you're like, wait a second, why did he get such like a worse punishment than the other people? It was because he was one of the first people convicted under this Edmunds Act. And it's not fair. It's really not fair. And I think he must have felt the unfairness of it. On the other hand, he did get to be very good friends with Lorenzo Snow while in prison, because they were prison mates. Yay. Anyways, I don't know if they're going to mention that, but I thought I'd just throw that out there. Okay. Just prior to passing sentence, George Charles S. Zane asked him if he had anything to say why judgment should not be pronounced, and he promptly replied, "Your Honor, since the jury in my case have seen proper to find a verdict of guilty, I have only this to say why judgment should not be passed upon me. I very much regret that the laws of my country should come in conflict with the laws of God, but whenever they do, I shall invariably choose to obey the latter. If I did not so express myself, I should feel unworthy the cause I represent. The Constitution of the United States expressly provides that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. It cannot be denied, I think, that marriage, when attended and sanctioned by religious rites and ceremonies, is an establishment of religion. The anti-polygamy law of 1862 and the Edmunds-Tucker law of 1882 were expressly designed to operate against marriage as believed in and practiced by the Latter-day Saints. They are therefore unconstitutional, and of course, as such, cannot command the respect that constitutional laws would. That is all I have to say, Your Honor." I mean, that's pretty strong language as well. I mean, I appreciate that he felt like he was being treated unfairly and that he was even being treated in an unconstitutional manner. Yeah. At the same time, it didn't change his sentence. He did have to serve his sentence. Elder Clawson was but 27 years of age when this terrible experience came to him. Think of it, a young man, full of the energy of life, with bright prospects opening before him, condemned to a loathsome prison cell for 4 years. What an eternity that 4 long years must have appeared to that young man. What heart-crushing, hopeless misery! A man of refinement, accustomed to the society of the noble and pure, forced now to associate with men, low and degraded with vice, to come in close contact with them, yes, and to eat and to sleep with men repulsively vile and debased, to mingle with robbers and murderers, to be served with poor food, hardly fit to eat, to breathe the filthy tobacco-laden air of the cells. Surely the very gates of hell or the grave could not have been more dreaded. That's a little bit dramatic, I think, but yeah, it doesn't sound fun to me either, though. There was but one source from which to ask relief, God the Merciful, and from him and his comforting spirit the young man received the strength to carry him through the awful ordeal. Is that all they're going to say about that? Okay, let's go a little bit farther. This short sketch cannot give a detailed account of Elder Clawson's experience in the Utah Penitentiary. For a long time the prison officials treated him with indignities. He had to bear the insults of his fellow convicts, some of whom took delight in persecuting the lone Mormon. After a time, other brethren were received at the pen, and Elder Clawson's life became more bearable. His father, Bishop H.B. Clawson, entered the prison in November 1885 and remained nearly 6 months. Naturally, the young man took great comfort in his father's society, though at the same time grieved to see him in prison. Slowly the months lengthened into years. His brethren came and went, but Rudger was still there. The great number of Mormon convicts had its modifying influence on the prison, and its life was easier to bear. During Elder Clawson's incarceration, President Lorenzo Snow served a term in prison. The aged apostle was a great comfort to the brethren in showing them how to bear the affliction with due fortitude. Elder Clawson was pardoned by President Grover Cleveland, and he left the penitentiary December 1st, 1887, after 3 years and like 4 months or something like that. During my imprisonment of 3 years, 3 years, 1 month, and 10 days, my bad, says Elder Clawson, I never once felt to murmur or complain as I emerged from the prison walls. My faith in the principle of plural marriage was just as firm and unshaken as when I entered. I felt to praise and glorify the Lord that he had deemed me worthy to suffer bonds and imprisonment in defense of the right. All right, I'm going to pause here again because they completely skipped over something that I found out later from a different article. And that is, so he had married 2 wives, and that was why he was in prison. Yeah? And it turned out that his first wife, whose name I can look up in a little bit, left him while he was in prison and took their little son with her. And, I mean, while I can't really blame her for not wanting to be, with somebody who is a convicted felon, what I can blame her for is the fact that that convicted felon was only a convicted felon because of her, basically. Not necessarily because of her, but because he was married. And, like, that's a stupid reason to leave someone, like, in my opinion. But, seriously, she filed for divorce while he was in prison. So he went in, married to 2 wives. He came out, married to 1. And if he had only been married to 1 when he went in, he wouldn't have gone in the first place. Like, I feel like that's another, like, little slap in the face of, like, see, life isn't fair, this sucks. This really sucks. And, yeah, like, it's crazy to me how unfair it was. So those are the 2, like, major incidents of his young, like, adulthood. But yeah, like, it's a crazy time. I mean, that he went to prison wasn't strange. That he went for 8 times longer than anyone else, yeah, is the weird part. And, yeah, like, it's just very unfair. And I'll bet he felt that injustice every moment of that time. It's just a sign of really life really isn't fair. Yeah. Anyways, let's keep going. The scene of action again changes. Elder Clawson received a letter from President Wilford Woodruff dated December 23, 1887, calling him to preside over the Box Elder Stake of Zion. This was a Christmas present indeed. At the quarterly conference of Box Elder Stake, held in Brigham City, February 5, his name was presented and sustained. Elder Clawson at once moved to Brigham and entered upon the discharge of his duties. So he didn't even live in Box Elder Stake when he was called as stake president. He had to move there. Upon his presidency of the Box Elder Stake has come well up to the front rank in the completeness of its church organizations and the general progressiveness of the saints. During his presidency, a new meeting house was erected in 11 of the 14 wards of the stake. At the destruction of the Brigham Tabernacle by fire, President Clawson at once took steps for its rebuilding, and 13 months afterwards, the elegant new tabernacle was erected, paid for, and dedicated. President Clawson was called to the apostleship at the General Conference held October 9, 1898. Since that time, he has been occupied in the business of his calling in traveling, organizing, instructing, and in office work for the church. What, Brother Clawson, asked the writer of this sketch, has been the most potent factor in aiding you to success in life? And the answer unhesitatingly was, my success in life, if I have attained to any, is due to a fixed and unyielding determination on my part to seek and abide by counsel. I know there is safety in counsel, and that he who turns therefrom and seeks to become a law unto himself must surely fall. Nephi Anderson. The reason it stops there is because this was written in 1900, so this is only 2 years after his call to the apostleship. So, I want to quickly go to my article on him, because we're missing kind of the rest of his life. There is another point that happened in his life, but it hadn't happened at the time of writing this article. So, and that is that he was called into the first presidency of the church. Now, okay, so what happened was George Kincannon died in, I believe it was May, or is it April? Anyway, it's spring of 1901. So it's shortly after this. And then Rudger Clawson was called as Lorenzo Snow's second counselor in the first presidency in October. However, Lorenzo Snow died like 10 days later. So he was never really able to become part of the first presidency because of that. Yeah. So, but he was technically in the first presidency for a very short time. Let's see if I can find that. Yeah. On 6 October 1901, Elder Clawson was sustained as a counselor in the First Presidency, but was never ordained because President Snow died 4 days later, dissolving the First Presidency. So it was only 4 days, my bad. This does not... Okay, I've got it mixed up with the 10th of October. That's why. This does not mean, however, that he didn't feel the weight of his calling, as much as anyone can feel it. At the time of his sustaining, he said, "I want to say that this call has come to me as a great surprise. Doubtless as great a surprise to me as to you who are assembled upon this occasion. I feel my weakness and my inefficiency, and that there is nothing that could make me equal to the acceptance of this appointment, of this high responsibility, except a knowledge that this work is of the Lord. I testify to you that this is the work of the Lord. I feel and realize that the Lord can make his servants equal to every responsibility. I have this faith and this desire. I am willing to work and to labor wherever the Lord wants me to labor, under the direction of my brethren. I desire your faith and prayers and your support, that you will sustain me in this high calling, and I desire to sustain and hope to be able to sustain my president, President Lorenzo Snow. I desire to be a help and a strength to him, and a counselor in very deed. It is the aim of my life that wherever I am called to labor in any position, I give my heart and soul to that labor." I feel like this is very Rudger Clawson, yeah? Okay, so another thing he did was he presided over the European Mission in April of 1910. He was called to preside over the European Mission, which consisted of the British, Scandinavian, Swiss, and German and South African missions. One change he made was to print a book of instructions that he sent to the 13 presidents of the various conferences. This helped to avoid unnecessary repetition and is typical of the kinds of changes he tended to make when serving in a presiding position. So he basically wrote the first handbook, yeah, for the mission. In October 1912, he called a meeting of all the French-speaking missionaries in the Netherlands and the Swiss-German missions and reopened the French mission after a prohibition of missionaries for nearly 50 years. Meanwhile, anti-Mormon sentiment was very strong in the British Isles. Winston Churchill had even suggested that the activities of the Mormon missionaries be observed. There were numerous demonstrations, typically organized by the ministers of other congregations, and Elder Clawson found himself facing a mob for the second time in his life in Bristol, England, 17 November 1912. Regarding some of the difficult experiences, Elder Clawson did not let them get the best of him. He used these brushes with evil to add to his own strong testimony. I'm going to skip over that quote, but it is pretty powerful. "What doth it profit a man if he gain the whole world and in the end lose his own immortal soul?" Yeah. Despite opposition, Elder Clawson was determined to keep the mission strong. In fact, his oldest living son, Hiram Bradley, served an honorable 29-month mission in Great Britain at this time. In April 1913, he was released as president of the European Mission. On 10 March 1921, he succeeded Anton H. Lund as president of the Quorum of the 12. Yeah, so that was under Heber J. Grant. Holding such a responsible position in the church during the Great Depression and the beginning of World War II was not easy. He did his best to help the members of the church not to lose hope. And then there's another quote, which I'm going to skip again. On 21 June 1946, at the age of 86, President Rudger Clawson died of pneumonia. He had served as president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles for 22 years, meaning that if Heber J. Grant had lived such a long life, President Clawson would have been president of the church. He had been married a total of 3 times and fathered 10 children. And then I have my own conclusion that I'd like to read. After such glowing reports, what more can be said about the kind of man Rudger Clawson was? He was a man who always lived true to his principles. He never compromised, nor did anything he felt would be wrong. To make sure he was always on the right side, he followed his priesthood leader's counsel to the letter. His view of time and eternity is also reflected in his testimony, which he seems always to have had, and his taking for granted of the plan of salvation. Of course the work goes on after this life. Why would we be working here if it didn't, seem to be his sentiment. He had a humorous side to him and showed his affection for people through his humor. He had the kind of courage that 5-star generals would be proud of, standing up before mobs and bravely going to prison even though there seemed to be no reason for it. He wasn't afraid of adversity and patiently bore all things the Lord saw fit to inflict upon him. Yeah, that's my conclusion of Rudger Clawson. I find him a very admirable person. Also, the scripture I chose for him was 2 Chronicles 19:11. Deal courageously, and the Lord shall be with the good. I think that that really fits him. I don't know of any other person that I would consider as brave. I can't imagine being in a lot of the situations that he was in. Like, if I had been, I think I would have needed some serious therapy just to get through the day. But he seemed to be okay. Like, it's crazy to me how well he dealt with everything. Yeah, it's just lots of admiration there. So he's one of my favorite people. Yeah, he really is. I think that he was just such an admirable person. He just was amazing. And I think that anyone who hears about his story would agree with me. And it's just that, wow, he is really an amazing person, isn't he? Yes, he was. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed learning about Rudger Clawson as well. If you did, please give the video a like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.